Prologues and Epilogues. Maurice here from NovelCopy.com, and today we're going to be talking about prologues and epilogues. Should you include one in your novel? Well, right off the bat, I want to say that I'm not a big fan of prologues and epilogues. I think that the story that you can write fits nicely into the novel itself. I think by, bracketing it off with a prologue and an epilogue may or may not do, more harm to your story, but we'll get to that later. How I want to talk about this is I want to bring up the pros and cons of a prologue and an epilogue, and then let you decide for yourself, right? So let's start with a prologue. Okay, what are some good things about a prologue, right? Okay, well, they allow you to set up the rules of your story. So let's say you're writing, like a Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones or some type of fantastical, speculative fiction where rules really need to be set down so the reader knows what's going on, right? The prologue is a perfect place to do it, okay? They can kind of get that information out of the way without having to bog down the rest of the story during your novel. Another good thing about a prologue is that you get to discuss a character in the prologue, right? So it can be something about the protagonist, like a special moment about the protagonist, or even better, it can be something about like a side character, some character who might seem, kind of irrelevant throughout the story, but he or she did something in the prologue that comes up as very relevant and important to the plot or to the protagonist later on in the story. So there is that. So now let's get to the cons of a prologue, right? So they exist kind of on a psychological level, right? They're letting the reader know that they need to read this before they need to read this. So it's kind of like you're messing with people. That's how I know that's how some readers take the prologue and the epilogue. So it's basically, basically me, when I read a novel, I just want to read the novel. Like, I want to go full blast. I'm ready to rock and roll. Like, I want to read your story right now. Tell me your story. You have a nice story to tell me about it. I shouldn't have to read, a pre-chapter before the story, like a chapter before the chapter. That just doesn't work for me. It lets me know it works on a like a metafiction level, and I'll get to the metafiction later on. Don't waste my time. I want to start your story. Let me start your story. If there's anything important, let me know within your story. I shouldn't have to read the chapter before it. Another thing is that prologues tend to go on too long. They just keep going and going and going, 10 pages, 20 pages for a prologue, and it's like, that's as long as a chapter. If you are going to write a prologue or an epilogue, keep it short, 2 pages, 3 pages max, or be different and have it just be like 3 paragraphs, you know what I mean? See what you can do with just 3 paragraphs as a prologue. Another thing too is that if the prologue, isn't immediately captivating, if it's not fun and interesting right off the bat, that's going to bore the reader. The reader will stop reading the prologue and they'll go right to the novel, and they will always have it in the back of their mind that they didn't read the prologue first. And another bad thing about a prologue is that, newbie writers tend to use it for backstory. Oh my God, do not put backstory in your first chapter or your prologue at all. If you have to do a backstory, sprinkle it in throughout the entire novel. Don't put it in one specific chapter. That is a terrible move. You do not want to do that. So do not put backstory in your prologue ever. Okay, so those are some cons of the prologue. So now let's go to the epilogue. So what are some good things about the epilogue? Well, I'm kind of more partial. I'm more sympathetic to the epilogue than I am the prologue. I've read books before that didn't have a prologue, but they had an epilogue, and I'm totally cool with that. I'm totally fine with that. The epilogue, like I said, I'm more sympathetic to it because it exists after I have experienced the entire story. I still think that it doesn't need to exist. If you're writing a series, it's a good place to advertise the sequel, right? I mean, think of an epilogue, right, as like an end credit scene in a movie, right? So the movie ends, and now the credits start to roll, and then all of a sudden, you know, there's a scene. Well, that's kind of like what an epilogue is. It's to kind of tie up any loose ends that were made during the entire story, right? Also, it can provide for one last powerful punch of action, or even better, emotion. I mean, you want to leave the story on an emotional impact. I mean, you really want to affect the reader emotionally through your story, no matter what genre your story is. And an epilogue, if you're going to include it, an epilogue is good for that. Like I said before, I can kind of see the usefulness of an epilogue because I have had the chance to read your entire 400 to 500 page novel. I know the characters, and that kind of gives an excellent send-off to those characters by having an epilogue. And you know, in that way, it's kind of very meta, like I mentioned earlier. Now, when you deal with metafiction, you're dealing with self-awareness. Now, all art is self-aware, has meta to it in some different level, right? Now, the prologue and the epilogue are very meta-heavy. Okay, they're basically speaking directly to the reader when you have a prologue or an epilogue, especially an epilogue, because like I said, they've just experienced the whole novel, and now it's saying, okay, it's all over, but now here is the ending to the ending. This is specifically made for you after we have made that entire journey of your novel. Okay, so the epilogue is very meta, and I think that if you do include it, because it's meta, you need to be very careful what you include and what you don't include, because it might come off too self-aware, too, you know, wink wink, you know, I know you're reading this, and you don't want it to be too self-aware, because that just comes off boring and tacky. So now some cons about the epilogue. I don't really have that many cons about the epilogue. Overall, I don't think that it should exist at all, because you already told your story. But kind of in a way, it's kind of an insult to the reader, more so than a prologue, because, you know, your book ended, you just finished with the last chapter, and now, you know, wait, you know, that's not the last chapter. You know, here's the real last chapter. There's more to go. You know, it's an insult. It's an insulting way to end your story. I mean, it doesn't really need to be done twice. Okay, an ending is an ending. That's it. Okay, so what is the solution to the prologue and epilogue? Well, I think that you should really consult your agent about the epilogue and the prologue. And what I mean is, you should write your entire novel, right? 400 to 500 pages, whatever, how long it is, right? Edit it, you know, first draft, second draft, third draft. And then when you're ready to send it out to an agent and they accept you and they're going to need to do more revisions on it, I think that you should ask them and say, hey, listen, you know, I have a good idea for the prologue, I have a good idea for the epilogue. You know, what do you think? You know, does the story need it? Are you against it? You know, and depending what they say, if they say, yeah, do it, okay, then fine. You know, write that prologue, write that epilogue. But, you know, it'll be easier for you to write that prologue and epilogue after they say, yeah, write it, because you're going to have already written, you know, a 500-page story, so you're going to know your story inside and out. You're going to know the characters, the setting, the plot, everything about it. So writing that prologue and epilogue afterwards is actually going to be better for you. It's going to be easier for you, and you're going to include the proper information in the prologue and epilogue because you have already written it. So that's my advice. I think that you should wait on it, consult your agent. Okay, so there's my opinions on prologues and epilogues. Do you agree with me, or do you think I'm completely way off base? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and like. And if you want to learn more creative writing tips, you can go to my website at noblecopy.com. And until then, have a good one.